The movie opens with Abigail, a single mom of two, waking up next to her one-night stand, Ben. As she looks around, Ben pulls her closer. This, however, doesn't please Abigail, and she grows increasingly annoyed by Ben's clingy behavior. After lying there for a bit, both Ben and Abigail finally get up and head to the bathroom to brush their teeth. The scene then shifts to the previous day, where we see Abigail frantically running through the streets of a busy city, clutching a guitar in her hand. She runs as fast as she can, eventually reaching a school, where she drops off the guitar with a note before walking away. Upon returning home, Abigail begins working on her project. As she focuses on her designs, she gets a call from her two children. Her son Luke proudly shows her a spaceship model he recently made and talks about his school progress. Since she's divorced, her kids spend some days with her and others with her ex. Abigail praises Luke for his hard work and urges him to bring all his schoolwork when she picks him up tomorrow. She then talks to her daughter, Wallace, asking if she's doing okay. Wallace assures her that she is, before handing the laptop over to their dad so he can speak with Abigail. Moments later, Abigail's ex, Tim, takes over the call and starts chatting with her. He greets her politely and asks how she's doing. Abigail replies that she's good and informs him that he forgot to take Luke's guitar when he picked the children up for the weekend. Tim apologizes and thanks Abigail for dropping it off at Luke's school. The two then say their goodbyes and hang up the call. Soon after, Abigail returns to work, spending the rest of the day cutting out and making the finishing touches to her designs. Later that night, she receives a text from her friend, asking her to meet up. At first, Abigail tries to decline, but after much insistence from her friend, she reluctantly agrees. She quickly gets ready and heads to a nearby pub. While sipping her drink, Ben walks up to her and starts flirting. It turns out Abigail's friend had set her up on a blind date with Ben. As expected, Abigail isn't interested and only gives him curt responses. Ben, however, doesn't give up and asks more about her. Eventually, Abigail grows so bored that she texts her friend, asking to be rescued from the situation. Unfortunately, her friend urges her to stay and continue the conversation, so Abigail is forced to chat with Ben. Slowly, the two begin to warm up to each other. They order more drinks and decide to start over. As the conversation continues, they find each other increasingly interesting. Ben really likes Abigail, but realizes that she doesn't feel the same. Sensing this, he jokes that he already knows how things will end, and it'll be nothing short of tragic. Abigail laughs and calls him an overthinker. Still, Ben insists that since their relationship is bound to fail, they should do 10 things before their inevitable breakup. Abigail thinks this is ridiculous, but agrees to go along with it. Together, they begin brainstorming the 10 things they want to do before parting ways for good. They decide to go to a deserted beach, learn surfing, and doing loads of other things. Eventually, after a long night of talking, Ben and Abigail decide to give their relationship a shot and see where things lead. They plan to head to a bridge to clear their heads. They catch a taxi and make out passionately in the back seat. Remarkably, this happens to be number 1 on their list of things to do before they break up. They reach second base in the taxi, and it's clear they're both deeply attracted to each other. Eventually, they go back to Ben's place, where they continue kissing passionately and end up making love. The next morning, Abigail wakes up and fully comprehends everything that happened the night before. She and Ben go to the bathroom, brushing their teeth in complete silence. Later, Abigail returns home and resumes her work. While doing so, she gets a text from Ben, saying he had a great time and would love to complete the rest of the list with her. Abigail initially tries to ignore him, but curiosity gets the best of her, and she replies quickly. After a brief conversation, Ben asks Abigail out on a date, suggesting they go out for dinner and complete the second thing on their list, reading the Sunday newspaper line by line together. Although intrigued by the idea, Abigail declines because she's having the kids over. As expected, Ben is hurt by this. A month later, Abigail picks up her kids from school and heads back home. While organizing the groceries, she starts feeling nauseous. Worried, she takes a pregnancy test, which comes back positive. Unsure how to react, Abigail decides to tell Ben. She texts him, saying there's an emergency, and asks him to meet her at a cafe. After getting the text, Ben immediately meets Abigail and asks what's wrong. At first, Abigail avoids the topic, distracting Ben with small talk. But soon she feels overwhelmed and can't hold it in any longer. She finally reveals that she's pregnant from their one-night stand. Unsurprisingly, Ben is shocked by the sudden news and has a panic attack. He sits down in the middle of the road, apologizing profusely to Abigail. When he asks her what she plans to do, she admits that she hasn't decided yet. Since Ben has never had a healthy relationship with his parents, he panics at the thought of becoming a father. Abigail reassures him that no matter what happens, he won't have to deal with the situation at all. However, Ben, still in a state of frustration, says he doesn't want to be a deadbeat dad and, out of panic, asks if she got pregnant on purpose. Abigail is obviously offended by this and tries to walk away, but Ben quickly runs after her and apologizes for saying something so thoughtless. To make matters worse, Ben starts talking about how Abigail won't be able to handle the responsibilities of 3 kids on her own, adding that he doesn't want to stay with her just because of the baby. He even adds that no man would want to be with a single mom of 3. Abigail, who is now more pissed than ever, tells Ben that he has got some issues and storms away. Ben tries to chase after her again, but this time she calls him a sociopath and attempts to leave. Despite this, Ben keeps pleading with her to stay, and eventually, she gives in. The two continue walking and talking for a while, discussing the possibilities ahead of them. Eventually, they return to Ben's place, where they make love again. The next morning, Abigail and Ben wake up next to each other, uncertain about what to do next. Ben suggests they spend some time getting to know each other, since they hardly know anything about one another. Abigail, who finds Ben weird and immature, isn't thrilled by the idea, but given that she's pregnant with his baby, she reluctantly agrees. Ben eventually proposes that they should continue with the pregnancy and see where it leads. He explains that, at 38 years old, and without any family, this might be his last chance to build one, and he doesn't want to give it up. Abigail is confused by his sudden change of heart and asks why he said all those nasty things the night before. That's when Ben admits he panicked and wasn't thinking clearly. Feeling overwhelmed, Abigail decides to go home and consider all her options. As she leaves, Ben suggests they go on a proper date to figure out what might be the best path forward. Abigail reluctantly agrees and quickly leaves the apartment. Friday comes around, and Abigail prepares for their date. After hiring a babysitter and saying goodbye to her kids, she meets up with Ben. Wanting to try something different, they ride around on their bikes while talking. Eventually, they come across a small river and sit by the banks, sharing snacks and discussing their pasts, hobbies, and interests. They joke around for a bit and bond really well with each other. Later, feeling adventurous, Abigail and Ben sneak into an abandoned swimming pool. They walk around quietly, taking in their surroundings. The two then lay down on the cold swimming pool floor and share a passionate kiss. At that moment, Ben confesses that he really likes her and wants to go on a lot more dates. Abigail admits she feels the same. That night, they return back to Abigail's house. They quietly enter her bedroom and fall asleep wrapped in each other's arms. The next morning, Abigail hears her kids knocking on the door. Now panicking, she asks Ben to leave immediately. She then tells her kids to wait in the room while she gets ready for the day. She tells her children to wait while she gets ready. Once they agree, she says goodbye to Ben, watching as he sneaks out. However, Luke spots Ben leaving and asks who he is. Left with no choice, Abigail introduces Ben to Luke and Wallace as her friend. They all sit in the living room, where Ben awkwardly tries to start a conversation. Luke stares at him in confusion, while Wallace responds with sarcastic remarks, making things even more uncomfortable. Sensing the tension, Abigail makes up an excuse and asks Ben to leave. He quickly exits, heading back to his apartment. Later, Abigail asks her kids how they feel about Ben. Both Luke and Wallace immediately say they hate him. Abigail laughs and reassures them that they'll warm up to him once they spend more time together. Later that day, Abigail meets her best friend, Kate, and tells her everything that has happened. As expected, Kate asks what Abigail plans to do about the pregnancy. Abigail admits she isn't sure, explaining that she wants to be absolutely certain before making any decisions about an abortion, because she doesn't want to regret it later. Kate nods, but suggests that abortion might be the best option. In response, Abigail explains that since she now has 2 kids of her own, she has a different perspective on abortion. Shortly after, Abigail returns home and decides to take a shower. While picking out her clothes, she comes across a pair of baby socks. As she looks at them, she gets really emotional and feels as though having the baby is what's best for her. Moments later, Abigail and Ben take Luke and Wallace to a nearby park. As the kids happily play, Abigail watches them with a smile, while Ben just finds this incredibly boring. Noticing this, Abigail tells him all the responsibilities of being a parent, making sure he knows what he's signing up for. She then goes to play with her kids for a while. Ben watches them, and as he envisions having a family of his own, he grows excited. He runs over to join in, and soon Luke and Wallace are laughing and playing with him. Seeing this, Abigail feels relieved and more confident in her decision to keep the baby. A couple of hours later, the 4 of them explore the city, enjoying ice cream as they walk. After a fun day together, they return home for dinner. At the table, Ben strikes up an exciting conversation with Luke, sharing stories about his travels and the cultures he's experienced. Luke listens eagerly, while Wallace just rolls her eyes. Noticing Wallace's lack of interest, Ben shifts the conversation to her hobbies and even offers to take her surfing. Wallace cheers up at the idea and readily agrees. After dinner, Luke asks Ben for surfing lessons, and Ben immediately agrees. Clearing the table, he playfully tells Luke to lie down flat on it. Luke, full of excitement, follows Ben's instructions, practicing surfing on the dinner table while giggling. This scene warms Abigail's heart, causing her to grow really fond of Ben. A month later, Abigail and Ben go on a double date with Kate and her boyfriend. Over dinner, the four of them chat about their lives and interests. At one point, Kate's boyfriend asks Ben if he and Abigail are planning to get married. Ben enthusiastically responds that he would love to marry Abigail and raise a family with her. Kate smiles upon hearing this and turns to Abigail, asking if she's on board with the idea. Abigail just shrugs, admitting that she's not sure yet. When Ben adds that he wants to raise their child together while falling more in love with Abigail, she gives him a strange look. She asks if he's really sure about this, and Ben nods excitedly. Abigail blushes, realizing that she's starting to fall for him too. That night, while Ben, Abigail, and the kids are sleeping together, Ben's phone buzzes with a notification. Curious, Abigail checks the message. It's from a stranger, telling Ben that he left his clothes at their house, and even asking him to check his email for something exciting. Now suspicious, Abigail decides to look through Ben's laptop. To her horror, she finds a sensual video of another woman in his email. Her heart breaks, and she becomes really insecure about her own body. Not knowing how to handle the situation, she quietly returns to the bedroom and pulls her children away from Ben. The next morning, Abigail remains calm. After dropping the kids off at school, she heads to the grocery store, and later she makes her way to Ben's apartment. Just as she's about to enter, a woman approaches her and asks if Ben is with her. Now concerned, Abigail asks who the woman is. The woman introduces herself as Ben's ex. She then reveals that Ben left her for Abigail without even collecting his belongings back from her place. With a sly smile, the ex tells Abigail that Ben had said he was only with Abigail because she got pregnant, and he had called her a train wreck with a messy life. As expected, Abigail is devastated to hear all this, but tries her best not to break down. Moments later, Abigail enters Ben's apartment and gathers her belongings. She also decides to stay out of her apartment for a while to avoid Ben. Amidst all this, Ben repeatedly tries to call her. He shows up at her door unannounced and bangs on it, but Abigail ignores him. One day, while she's packing her stuff, Ben manages to break into her apartment. He confronts her, asking what's going on. Abigail, visibly upset, tells him she knows all about his ex and his supposed perception of her. She then coldly declares that she doesn't want to see him anymore. Ben pleads with her, insisting that he's been completely faithful to her ever since she told him about the pregnancy. He also denies ever saying those nasty things about her, but Abigail doesn't believe him. With a heavy heart, she tells him that she's done with him. Despite Ben's refusal to end the relationship, Abigail pushes him out of her home. Later that night, Abigail heads over to Tim's house and desperately knocks on the door. When Tim finally opens it, he gives her a very disappointed look and asks what she's doing there. In response, Abigail tells him that she really misses the kids and wants to hug them. While wiping her tears, she begs Tim to let her in so that she can crawl into bed with Luke and Wallace. Tim notices Abigail's distress and lets her in. He then asks her what happened. Overwhelmed with emotions, Abigail breaks down crying and hugs Tim tightly. The two spend the entire night hugging and talking about what happened. The next morning, Abigail goes back to her place and continues working to distract herself. Hours later, she hears a knock on the door. When she opens it, she sees none other than Ben standing before her. Trying not to cry, Ben profusely apologizes to Abigail and tells her that he really wants her and the baby. He explains that whenever he feels overwhelmed or pressured, he tends to act irrationally. That was the reason why he contacted his ex. However, Ben explains that he never did anything with his ex and clarifies that he never said anything bad about Abigail. By this point, Abigail is also sobbing. She hears him out and decides to give him a chance. She hugs him tightly and immediately pulls him into her bedroom. Once there, the two kiss passionately and end up making love. The next day, Ben decides to fulfill his promise and takes both Luke and Wallace surfing. After that, he gets an inflatable pool and a surfboard so they can continue practicing surfing at home. When Abigail sees this, she squeals in excitement and immediately runs toward the pool. She watches as the kids giggle and swim around with Ben. It's clear that both Luke and Wallace are really fond of him now. That night, all four of them decide to watch a movie. As they munch on popcorn and watch their favorite movie, Ben becomes emotional. With a deep sigh, he thanks Abigail for showing him what having a family is like. He exclaims that this is all he's ever wanted, and now that he has it, he never wants to lose it. Abigail smiles, recognizing how much Ben has grown over the past few months. At that moment, Ben asks Luke and Wallace if it's okay for him to stick around. The kids happily reply that they want him in their lives. Needless to say, both Ben and Abigail are relieved to hear this. Weeks pass by, and Abigail and Ben grow closer than ever. Even the kids get accustomed to having Ben around. He helps them with homework, cooks delicious meals, and drops them off at school. They also have weekly movie nights, which brings them even closer together. Now that Ben and Abigail are officially together, Ben suggests they continue working through the list of things they plan to do before their breakup. They read the Sunday newspaper line by line, as they had discussed before, and plan to finish the entire list soon. One day, Abigail decides to meet Kate at a coffee shop. There, Kate asks what her final decision is. Abigail responds that she's now 15 weeks pregnant and plans to keep the baby. Kate, now serious, asks her if she's absolutely sure about the baby since she can't back out anymore. She tries to convince Abigail to terminate the pregnancy, stating that it's a huge responsibility. Abigail is shocked by Kate's reaction and asks why she has such a problem with the pregnancy. Kate replies that she just doesn't want Abigail to base her life on someone she barely knows. She adds that Abigail knows nothing about Ben's past and that this is all a big mistake. As expected, Abigail is deeply offended by Kate's condescending tone. Unable to take it anymore, Abigail tells Kate that she's very happy and even accuses her of being jealous. Hearing this, Kate scoffs and asks Abigail if she has even thought about the effect the pregnancy will have on her kids. She tells Abigail that being in love with Ben doesn't mean she should ignore Luke and Wallace. Kate goes on to say that keeping the baby is reckless, selfish, and ignorant. Infuriated, Abigail snaps back that Kate doesn't have kids and wouldn't understand what it's like to be pregnant. She asserts that she shouldn't have to give up on her child just because of some difficult circumstances. Feeling attacked, Kate turns to leave, but before she goes, she warns Abigail that her relationship with Ben won't last long, and when it falls apart, she shouldn't come back crying. Abigail just scoffs at this and watches Kate storm off. A couple of days later, Abigail takes Ben and her children to her parents' house. There, she introduces Ben to her father and sisters and informs them that she's pregnant. They all congratulate her warmly and express their excitement about the pregnancy. Shortly after, everyone gathers around the dinner table and starts chatting. Seizing the opportunity, Abigail's father asks Ben how long he and Abigail have been dating. Not wanting to reveal the truth, Abigail lies, saying they've been together for a year. Her father then asks Ben a few more questions to get to know him better. Ben answers them all politely and even jokes around with her dad. After dinner, Abigail and Ben head back to her room and prepare to head to bed. Suddenly, Ben looks at Abigail and, in a serious tone, asks if she will marry him. Stunned, Abigail remains silent for a moment. She quickly comes back to her senses and hugs him tightly. Fighting back tears, she confesses that she doesn't know what to do. She explains that she can't say yes because they don't know each other well, but she also can't say no because she's fallen madly in love with him. After some thought, she happily says yes. Ben kisses her passionately, and they spend the night wrapped in each other's arms. The next day, Abigail and Ben go to the doctor together for an ultrasound. When Abigail sees her baby and hears its heartbeat, she becomes emotional. Ben, too, struggles to hold back his tears. Smiling, he thanks Abigail for her decision to keep the baby. A couple of days later, Abigail reminds Ben that they have to attend Wallace's dance class that day. Ben assures her that he'll be there on time and leaves. He then returns to his apartment, where he finds his ex waiting for him. Confused, he asks why she's there. His ex replies that she wants to spend some time with him. Reluctantly, Ben agrees to have a drink with her, but nothing more. His ex readily agrees, and they head to a nearby bar. At the bar, Ben's ex asks if he's happy with Abigail. Ben responds that he is excited about what's ahead. He then asks if she was ever in love with him. His ex says she was, and begins flirting with him. Ben, unable to walk away, decides to have a few more drinks with her, and ultimately misses Wallace's dance event. Meanwhile, Abigail and Luke attend Wallace's event, cheering her on enthusiastically. Abigail feels hurt by Ben breaking his promise, but decides to shrug it off. A few hours later, she and the kids return home, still with no sign of Ben. They have dinner together, laughing and joking as a family. Just then, Ben arrives and starts making excuses for why he couldn't attend. Abigail feels suspicious about his behavior, but doesn't think much of it. While having dinner, Abigail expresses her hurt over Ben's absence and urges him to let her know if he's ever stuck at work during important events like this. Instead of agreeing, Ben glares at her and tells her not to bother him when he's clearly had a bad day at work. The tension between the two continues to rise as they taunt each other continuously. At that moment, Wallace and Luke start fighting and running around the house, screaming and yelling. Abigail tries to calm them down, but they ignore her. Ben, now beyond frustrated, slams his hand on the table and yells at the kids to stop. Realizing what he's done, he quickly apologizes, but it's too late. The kids, now terrified, sit down quietly to finish their meal. Abigail, on the other hand, ignores him completely, now unsure about her decision to marry him. That night, Abigail confronts Ben and warns him never to lose his temper in front of the kids again. She explains that they're just children, who are a bit mischievous in the comfort of their own homes. Instead of apologizing, Ben doubles down, accusing Abigail of not raising her children properly. He asserts that he was never prepared for this chaos, and is now being forced to have a child of his own. Furious, Abigail reminds him that it's too late to back out now. Ben, with biting sarcasm, says that when his baby is born, he will raise it to be polite and disciplined, unlike Luke and Wallace. Hearing this, Abigail completely loses her temper, calling Ben an immature man-child who can't control his mood swings. As expected, the argument escalates, and Abigail begins to regret keeping the child. Meanwhile, Ben continues blaming her for going ahead with the pregnancy and burdening him unnecessarily. Fed up, Abigail yells at Ben to pack his things and leave her apartment immediately. Overwhelmed with emotions, she goes into her kids' room and falls asleep with them, their arms wrapped tightly around her. The next morning, Abigail wakes up and reflects on all the beautiful moments she shared with Ben. She thinks about how he cared for Luke and Wallace and wanted to be part of their little family. But after remembering last night's fight, she gets a harsh reality check. Sighing deeply, she gets ready for the day and heads back to work. She tries her best to move on, focusing on her children and continuing to work hard. A couple of weeks later, Abigail and Wallace go to Luke's music performance. As they watch him, Abigail's water breaks and she rushes to the hospital. Her best friend Kate drops the kids off at Abigail's parents' house and hurries to the hospital to support her. There, the two friends reconcile, apologizing for the things they had said to each other months ago. To Abigail's surprise, Ben also shows up at the hospital, trying to be there for her. After a few painful hours, Abigail gives birth to a beautiful baby. The scene now shifts to a year later, where Abigail, Luke, Wallace, and their baby sister are having a picnic together. The movie ends with the four of them playing and laughing, enjoying their time as a happy, close-knit family.